November 6, 1965. Bill Graham produced his first concert, a legal defense fundraiser for the San Francisco Mime Troupe at the Longshoreman's Hall. The bill included Jefferson Airplane and a band that was still calling themselves the Warlocks. Nobody in the crowd knew who they were. Graham didn't either. But that night sold out, and when he looked at the packed room and the cash box, he realized something. Rock and roll was about to explode in San Francisco, and nobody was treating it like a real business yet. Graham was a Holocaust survivor who'd fled Nazi Germany as a kid, grown up in a Bronx foster home, and earned a Bronze Star and Purple Heart in Korea. By 1965, he was managing the San Francisco Mime Troupe, and when they got busted for performing without a permit, he threw a benefit to pay their legal bills. The show made money, real money, so he did it again a month later, December 10, 1965, at the Fillmore Auditorium. Bigger venue, bigger crowd, same chaotic energy. And somewhere around this time, probably late November, maybe early December, the Warlocks picked a new name out of a dictionary, Grateful Dead. The exact date is fuzzy, the exact circumstances depend on who's telling the story. But by the time Graham really started paying attention to Jerry Garcia, they were the Grateful Dead, and they were unlike anything he'd ever seen. Because Graham wasn't meeting them at some club or rehearsal space. He was encountering them at the acid tests, Ken Kesey's psychedelic happenings, where the whole point was to dissolve reality itself. No set times, no real stage. The band would plug in and play for 6-7 hours straight, while Kesey's merry pranksters dosed the Kool-Aid and projected liquid light shows on every surface. People weren't there to watch a concert, they were there to experience something that had never existed before. And the Dead were the house band for that experiment. Years later, in a 1976 interview with Harvey Kubernick, Graham tried to explain what it was like meeting Garcia in that environment. I thought he and his entire band were from another planet. And look, he wasn't being poetic or trying to sound cool. The Dead in late 65, early 66 genuinely seemed alien. Garcia would stand there playing these long, wandering guitar lines that went nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The rhythm section was loose to the point of falling apart. Nothing about them made sense if you were thinking about pop music or even rock and roll as it existed in 1965. They were doing something else entirely, and most people couldn't even figure out what to call it. Here's the thing about Bill Graham, though. He believed in discipline. Start times mattered. Sound checks mattered. Paying people fairly and on time mattered. He'd survived the Nazis in Korea by staying organized, by following rules, by maintaining structure when everything around him was chaos. Everything about his background said these guys were a disaster waiting to happen. But he also recognized something that most people missed. The Dead weren't just another garage band getting high and making noise. They were trying to build something nobody had ever attempted before. And they needed someone who understood both the vision and the business. Someone who could exist in both worlds. Then came the Trips Festival in January 1966. Ken Kesey organized it, a 3-day psychedelic extravaganza at Longshoreman's Hall. Graham wasn't running it, but he was there, and at some point during the chaos, he got into it with Kesey. The details are murky depending on who you ask, but what's confirmed is this. During all that madness, Garcia's guitar got smashed, and Graham sat down and tried to fix it. Just grabbed some tape and tools and attempted to repair this kid's broken guitar in the middle of a psychedelic circus while everything else was falling apart around them. That moment mattered. Garcia remembered it. The Dead remembered it because it showed them something about Graham that all the yelling and strictness obscured. He actually gave a shit. He wasn't just some promoter looking to cash in on the scene. He cared about the music, about the bands, about making sure the shows actually happened, even when he thought you were completely insane. So when Graham leased the Fillmore Auditorium full-time and started booking regular shows in early 1966, the Dead became part of his roster. January 8, 1966, their first official Fillmore show. The bill was Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead, and a jazz set from Woody Herman's band. That cross-genre booking wasn't an accident or some hippie-free association experiment. Graham had a specific theory. If you exposed rock audiences to blues, jazz, and soul, you'd expand their consciousness without anybody having to take drugs to get there. You'd create something bigger than just another rock club. So he booked Big Mama Thornton with the Dead. December 10, 1966, the poster for that show, designed by Stanley Mouse and Alton Kelly, became one of the most iconic images of the era. Blues legend Big Mama Thornton, the woman who'd originally recorded Hound Dog before Elvis ever touched it, sharing a bill with this weird psychedelic band from the Hate. Graham booked Otis Redding at the Fillmore. Muddy Waters, B.B. King, Miles Davis would play there. He was building what he called rock theater, not just concerts, but total immersive experiences with professional sound systems, coordinated psychedelic light shows, and musical lineups that force people completely out of their comfort zones. And the Dead absorbed all of it. Garcia had come up through bluegrass. He'd played with the Sleepy Hollow Hog Stompers. He could play traditional American music in his sleep. Suddenly he's sharing stages with B.B. King and watching how King would bend a single note for 4 bars and make it say more than most guitarists said in a whole solo. The Dead's approach to improvisation got deeper, more rooted in the blues tradition they were pulling from. You can hear it in how Turn On Your Love Light evolved from 1967 to 68. Started as this enthusiastic but fairly straightforward cover. Then by 68, they're stretching it to 25 minutes and actually understanding what Bobby Bland was doing with that song, not just imitating it. But Graham gave them something even more important than musical education: time and space. Most promoters in the mid-60s expected bands to play 45 minutes, maybe an hour, tops. Get on, get off, keep the crowd rotating, sell more drinks. Graham learned fast that the Dead didn't work that way. In the same Kubernick interview, he put it like this: starting with the Grateful Dead, they always went to the gigs with the intention of putting it out there. They were the first ones who asked to play longer. So he let them. 2 hours, 3 hours, sometimes more. The Marathon Dead show, the thing that defined them for the next 30 years, crystallized at the Fillmore and Winterland under Graham's watch. Those 1967-68 shows where they'd stretch Viola Lee Blues to 15-20 minutes, where Alligator would go for half an hour, where Caution, Do Not Stop on the Tracks, became this 40-minute improvised journey. That was Graham creating the space for them to discover what they actually were. The Dead even briefly promoted shows themselves at the Carousel Ballroom in 68, that whole communal experiment in running their own venue. It didn't last, and eventually Graham took over that space too, turned it into Fillmore West. But the point is, they were learning from him, learning what it actually took to run a venue, to promote shows, to build something sustainable. But here's where the tension started building. Graham wasn't a hippie. He didn't care about dissolving boundaries or exploring consciousness through chaos. He wanted to run a professional operation. And the Dead were chronically, almost aggressively late. They'd show up 2 hours past the sound check, sometimes without all their equipment, usually stoned, occasionally not entirely sure which venue they were supposed to be at, and Graham would absolutely lose his mind. Diane Rappaport worked with Graham for years. She described his management style this way: if Bill's idea of fair didn't agree with you, he'd pummel you with words and then start yelling. He made a lot of people cry, but he was fair. That last part mattered to the Dead. Graham would scream at them about being late, about sound check, about professionalism, about treating the audience with respect. But then he'd pay them exactly what he promised, in cash, on time, every single show. No contracts needed. If Graham shook your hand and made a verbal agreement, he honored it. In the chaotic rip-off heavy world of 1960s rock promotion, that kind of integrity was almost unheard of. Garcia later called Graham our power guy, the guy that made rock and roll into an art form. Mickey Hart said Graham would sit up at night and dream this stuff, obsessing over every detail of the concert experience. Ben Fong Torres from Rolling Stone wrote that Graham believed if the parking lot experience was bad, the whole show would be bad. That's how deep his obsession ran. He wasn't just booking bands into a room, he was architecting entire experiences, thinking about every single touch point. And he protected them. When cops showed up at the Fillmore looking to bust people for drugs, Graham physically blocked them and called lawyers. When city officials tried to shut down shows over noise complaints or crowd control, he fought them in public hearings, gathered citizen petitions, hired legal teams. The Fillmore and Winterland weren't just music venues. They were fortresses where the counterculture could exist without getting immediately crushed by the establishment. The Dead understood that. They might have hated the punctuality obsession and the yelling, but they knew Graham was fighting battles they couldn't even see, dealing with shit that would have destroyed them if they had to handle it themselves. By 1968, though, the Dead were getting bigger and the business side was getting exponentially more complicated. They had no infrastructure, no organization. Money was coming in from shows and record deals and just disappearing into the void, and nobody knew where it was going. The band members barely communicated about finances. Garcia famously hated dealing with business stuff and would just sign whatever was put in front of him. They desperately needed serious management. Graham knew the business inside and out. He had connections across the industry. He was brutally honest, sometimes to the point of cruelty. And despite frequently thinking they were insane, he understood their vision. In that Kubernick interview, Graham admitted there were times when I really think the Grateful Dead were demented, insane. They could have made 10 times as much money, but he said yes anyway, probably because he genuinely believed in what they were trying to do. For a few months, maybe 6, maybe less, the timeline is genuinely murky. He tried to organize them, tried to get them to think strategically about touring, about recording, about building a career that could actually sustain itself long term. Tried to impose some structure on the beautiful chaos they'd created. It didn't work. The exact details of how it fell apart aren't well documented. There's no big blow-up that anyone recorded, no dramatic confrontation that made it into interviews. The Dead just quietly decided it wasn't working and moved on. Because here's the fundamental problem. Graham pushed back. That was his entire management philosophy. You want to play for free at every benefit that asks? Graham would push back and explain why you need to value your own work. You want to let fans record every show and trade the tapes? Graham would push back about intellectual property and potential revenue. You want to tour constantly with no plan and no breaks? Graham would push back about burnout and sustainability. For most bands, that pushback was valuable. For the Dead, it felt like someone trying to put boundaries on something that was supposed to be boundless. So they replaced him with Lenny Hart, Mickey Hart's father, a guy who ran a savings and loan, who seemed respectable and organized and professional. Finally, someone who understood business but wouldn't constantly challenge their decisions. Someone who'd enable their vision instead of questioning every move. Except Lenny Hart wasn't any of those things. He was a con man who saw an opportunity and took it. Within months, he was stealing from them, forging checks, hiding money in accounts they didn't know existed. The full scope of the embezzlement wouldn't become clear until 1970, but the disaster started the moment they chose enablement over accountability, the moment they picked someone who'd tell them what they wanted to hear instead of what they needed to hear. The Dead would eventually track Lenny down in Mexico. They'd get him sentenced to 6 months in jail, which is basically nothing for the amount he stole. They'd spend years digging out from the financial hole, years dealing with the psychological damage of having their drummer's own father rob them blind. And they'd write a song that's widely believed to be about him. He's Gone. That became one of their most enduring tunes, played over 300 times in concert over the next 25 years. Every time they played it in the early 70s especially, everyone in the room knew exactly who it was about. But that's episode 2's story. Right now, at the end of 1969, Bill Graham is out. The Dead have chosen trust over discipline, chaos over structure, and they have absolutely no idea what's coming. Graham kept promoting their shows. He wasn't their manager, but he was still booking them at Winterland and the Fillmore. Still the guy who could fill a room on a Tuesday night in the middle of winter. The relationship didn't end, it just got a whole lot more complicated. He'd spend the next 2 decades in this weird orbit around the dead, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always essential, always there. And here's what almost nobody talks about. Graham learned from them, too. In that Kubernick interview, he admitted it took him 4 or 5 years to figure out that yelling at bands right before they went on stage was counterproductive. In the long run, it's the public that has to get the good energy from them, he said. The Dead taught him that the audience experience mattered more than punctuality, that a show starting 30 minutes late wasn't a disaster if the band played for 3.5 hours once they finally got going, that sometimes you had to let chaos happen because that's where the magic actually lived. And standing there at the edge of the 70s with Lenny Hart's business card in hand and Bill Graham's warning still ringing in their ears, nobody, not Garcia, not the band, not even Graham himself, knew if this was liberation or the biggest mistake of their career. The next 3 years would answer that question, and the answer would nearly destroy everything they'd built.